Um, Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. This is a new session of Global Minds for Ukraine, a project which raises awareness about what is happening in Ukraine now, but also tries to look beyond and put what we observe today in a broader context of history and political science, economics, etc. We are very honored to host world-leading experts in their fields who can offer their thoughts and lectures and discuss their ideas with our students. Today, we are quite honored and very happy to have a friend of Kyiv School of Economics, Ambassador Jan Kelly, who has a very long career. He served as ambassador of the United States to Georgia from 2015 to 2018. Before that, he also served as the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, very famous organization OSCE. Before that, he served in the US State Department, and now he's also an academic who works at the Northwestern University, and he teaches a variety of classes about Russia and international relations. I've met Ambassador Kelly during some online events organized by Northwestern and Buffett Institute, and we had these wonderful moments to talk about the relationship between U.S. and Ukraine, about global affairs. It was very nice to hear his expertise and his support, and we are also very happy to have him here talking to our students. So, Ambassador Kelly, thank you very much for offering this time, and I pass the word to you.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy, for that very kind introduction. And let me say from the start, what an honor and a privilege it is to talk to you and the students of KSE. I think I, like all Americans, have been really inspired by the commitment of the Ukrainian people to defending their freedom and their independence. And more specifically, I've been very impressed by the strength of students at KSE. I follow KSE's president, Timothy Milovanov, and he has a daily, kind of a daily diary of events at KSE, and it's just so inspiring how you are handling this extraordinary situation. So as I say, this is a real honor and a privilege for me. As Timothy said, I'm now teaching at Northwestern, but I had 33 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, and much of that was spent in Eastern Europe, and also I've been many times to Kyiv. Actually, going back to 1976, that tells you how old I am. I went to Kyiv as a student. And I've been back there many times, most recently in 2014, when I went as an election observer for the OSCE and observed your presidential elections in the spring of 2014. So the subject of my talk today is something that has been on my mind because of what I have, how I've seen U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine evolve. I was assigned to Embassy Moscow in the late 80s, and then in the early 90s, I was assigned to the office that helped set up new embassies, including in Kyiv. I was one of the first Foreign Service officers to go to. It was originally Consulate General Kyiv, and of course, within a few months, it became Embassy Kyiv, and this was in 1992. And I remember it was housed initially. The embassy was housed initially in a Rayonni Soviet of the Communist Party. It was quite an experience for me to walk into the U.S. Embassy And at the end of the lobby was a big bust of Lenin. It's probably one of the only cases where there was a statue of Lenin in a US embassy. But what's been on my mind is, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay, so you can see that.
Yes,
All right.
we can see your slide full screen.
That's great. Okay, so what's been on my mind is that for too long, our policy towards Ukraine and also the other states in the USSR has been really a function of our policy towards Russia. And the main reason for this, I would argue, is because in the 90s, after decades of Cold War tension, we were focused on helping primarily a post-communist Russia integrate into liberal multilateral institutions and thus make Russia finally into a responsible actor in the democratic community of nations. And into this century, the first years of Putin, we continued to think that such integration was possible. Even after Putin's invasion of Georgia, many in the West, particularly in Western Europe, returned to business as usual with Russia. And the thinking was a Russia knit into a system of trade relations with Europe would be a peaceful, non-aggressive Russia. And I really regret to say it really wasn't until February 24th that the West genuinely woke up to the reality of the regime that we had been dealing with and realized that continuing to conduct business as usual with Putin didn't discourage his aggressive tendencies. It actually encouraged them. So to illustrate this tendency, I'd like to discuss three discrete events. One, the effort of two presidential administrations, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, to denuclearize Ukraine, ending, of course, as you all know, in the Budapest Memorandum and the denuclearization of Ukraine in 1994. Second, the response to the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And then finally, the response of the West to Russia's unilateral annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so I would argue that in all three cases, the West put undue pressure to accept terms that led directly or indirectly to Russia succeeding in gaining territory through the use of force. So going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the overarching priority of President George H.W. Bush was to support having only one post-Soviet nuclear state, and of course that was Russia. And at that time, in December of 1991, of course, there were 4 republics that had strategic nuclear weapons on their territory. And as you all know, that was Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Immediately, the leaders of newly independent Belarus and Kazakhstan agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. And the only state that, while in principle saying they wanted to denuclearize, but didn't take concrete steps toward, of course, was Ukraine. And in December 1991, the US National Security Council met to decide what our policy should be about the 1900 Ukrainian strategic nuclear weapons. And there was a pro and contra in this debate. So this was a discussion before President Bush. The Secretary of Defense at the time was Dick Cheney, and he took the view that it was important that that Ukraine maintained a nuclear deterrent against Russia. The other point of view was Secretary Jim Baker, and he believed it was in the U.S. interest to have only one nuclear state, Russia, and that was both for, I think, kind of policy reasons, in that, of course, the big hero of the August Putsch and the big hero of democratization at that time was Boris Yeltsin. And so he wanted to support Yeltsin. There was a pragmatic reason as well, according to his line of argument, and that's that the coordination of the strategic nuclear forces, of course, was all concentrated in Moscow, and most of the experts were based in Moscow as well. And President Bush supported Secretary Baker, and so the U.S. policy that became to push for Ukraine, as well as Kazakhstan and Belarus, to give up their nuclear weapons. In May 1992, then President Kravchuk visited the White House, had a meeting with President Bush, and he reiterated his desire to be a non-nuclear state and sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But he also highlighted his concern about deterring Russian designs, specifically on Crimea and the Donbass. And that, I think, surprised President Bush, but he also was really reluctant not to pressure Ukraine. And in a meeting with Washington officials in Moscow, Yeltsin complained about the slow pace of denuclearization on the part of Ukraine. And he said, you guys are being fooled by the Ukrainians. He told this delegation that Ukraine wanted to keep the nuclear weapons, and told this delegation that it was an error. The U.S. made a mistake recognizing Ukraine before it gave up its nukes, and he urged this delegation to put pressure on Ukraine to give up these nuclear weapons. So that was in November, and also in November, of course, Bush lost to Clinton, and the incoming Clinton administration realized the importance of dealing with nuclear proliferation, and they very early on in 1993 had a policy review, again in the National Security Council, and it decided to do precisely what Yeltsin suggested. It concluded that the U.S. should pressure Ukraine by conditioning the prospect of a full bilateral relationship on Ukraine agreeing to give up its 1,900 nuclear weapons. And in a not very shining moment for U.S. presidential diplomacy, in March 1993, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Zlenko met with President Clinton, and President Clinton told him that he would not meet with senior Ukrainian officials. I guess then Prime Minister Kuchma was planning to come to Washington, but he said he wouldn't meet with them until Kyiv gave up its nuclear weapons. So all along in 1992 and 1993, the Ukrainians made it clear that the reason they were reluctant to give up their nuclear deterrent was their perception that Washington was more committed to looking after its relations with Moscow and deprioritizing its relations with Kyiv. And there's an interesting declassified memo from former National Security Advisor Brzezinski to Clinton's National Security Advisor Anthony Lake. And he met with senior officials in Kyiv, and he reported that the Ukrainians remain preoccupied with what they perceive to be US-Russian discussions regarding their Ukrainian interests, and by the propensity of the West in general to ignore their difficult situation with Russia. The Ukrainians tend, therefore, to think of their nuclear weapons as a critical asset. For their part, the US, the Clinton administration, did offer to broker an agreement between Russia and Ukraine and set up a trilateral negotiating process from August 93 to January 94. But unfortunately, the US position did not take Ukraine's security concern as seriously as it should have. And as expected, the sticking point to coming to an agreement was language committing Moscow to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity and committing Washington to guaranteeing that territorial integrity. At that time, as they were negotiating the text, lawyers in the State Department and the White House said that, or recommended that the negotiators reject using the word guarantee when it comes to respecting territorial integrity, because, as they said, it would imply that in case of a Russian attack, the US would have to defend Ukraine. So this word guarantee, it has a legally binding connotation, and it was seen as kind of the equivalent of an Article 5 guarantee here in the NATO treaty. So what negotiators did was they said, we have to use another word. We can't use the word guarantee. So they suggested using the word assurances. And as I'm talking away here, I've forgotten to move my, there we go. I forgot to move my slideshow. So they suggested using the word assurances because it would be non-binding. And of course, the Russians and the Ukrainians both said, we don't have a word like assurances. So they said, we have to use the word guarantee, garantia. So we ended up with a situation where you basically had one text, the non-US text would use the word guarantee, and the US text used the word assurances. So this rhetorical sleight of hand mollified all sides. But of course, this kind of merely political language could, and of course did, lead to misinterpretation. And in the end, the final text provided the non-binding assurances the sides would respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine and only to seek UN Security Council action if Ukraine was attacked. And of course, in 2014, Russia did not feel obligated to respect this political and non-legally binding memorandum. And of course, the word memorandum itself in English implies an informal agreement. A better word would have been treaty, obviously, but the lawyers in the State Department and the White House didn't want to have that kind of binding formality. So moving to the second event that I want to talk about, and of course that's the invasion of Georgia. After this invasion, the West again prioritized, I would argue, its relationship with Russia over prioritizing the interests of the victim of Russian aggression, and failed to impose costs for the aggression. Also, much like what happened in 2014, the West, in the person of French President Nicolas Sarkozy, rushed to Moscow and Tbilisi to push for an immediate ceasefire, which Moscow signed, and like the Budapest Memorandum, subsequently ignored the ceasefire agreement, which we in Tbilisi were always mentioning. And also at the OSCE, we would mention that it obliged both sides to withdraw to their bases of origin. So that was one of the points of the ceasefire agreement. And of course, the Russians never withdrew. In fact, they poured in more troops, and of course recognized the two regions under Georgian sovereignty, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as independent states. So basically, the result of Tbilisi's acceptance of Sarkozy's terms was a de facto loss of 20% of their territory. And of course, Georgia's loss was Russia's gain. I think it's also worth recalling that Putin's invasion of Georgia occurred after a year after Russia launched a cyber attack against a NATO member, against Estonia, and that the lack of any serious response to that attack against a NATO member may very well have convinced Putin that he could get away with an invasion of his southern neighbor. And of course, just as Putin paid no price for the cyber aggression against Estonia a year later, Russia paid no real price for its actions against Georgia, aside from a brief suspension of the NATO-Russia Council and shelving a civilian nuclear agreement with Russia. Really nothing was done to impose any kind of costs. No one called for expelling Russia from the G8, let alone imposing any sanctions on Moscow. I have to point out, I was actually head of the Russia desk in the fall of 2008, and so I was privy to a lot of discussions. The Bush administration did want to impose sanctions. There was also the recognition that there wasn't much point in just unilateral sanctions. We had to do it together with Europe, but there was just no appetite in the midst of the greatest economic the greatest economic crisis since the 1930s to impose economic sanctions on a major world economy like Russia, and further roil or further disturb the economic consequences of what we call the Great Recession. But in the end, of course, it was Ukraine that paid the price for failing to impose costs on naked aggression against another state. And Russian journalist Arkady Ostrovsky, in an op-ed years later, wrote that Russia got away with the Georgia war cost-free, which ultimately contributed to Russian confidence that its later incursions into Ukraine would succeed. And then finally, of course, there's 2014. So, of course, you all know that when in February, the Little Green Men and other Russian forces seized key installations in Crimea, and ultimately, of course, the entire peninsula. At that time, the Obama administration quietly, not publicly, but quietly urged the Ukrainians not to resist, not to shoot back. And of course, the fear of the Obama administration was that it would immediately escalate the war into further violence. So the Ukrainian troops, of course, remained in their barracks. But once again, a failure to act doesn't prevent escalation by Putin. It actually encourages escalation. And of course, the non-resistance led to Putin's decision to seize even more territory. This time, of course, in the Donbass. And here again, as in 2008 with Sarkozy, the West, this time France and Germany, rushed to engage the invader and to negotiate a ceasefire. And of course, this was under the aegis of the Normandy format. So for 6 years, as in Georgia, Russia continued to occupy sovereign Ukrainian territory, while Westerners could sit back and assure themselves they were addressing the conflict by hosting negotiations. Now, to be clear, of course, in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, the first unilateral seizure of European territory since 1945, did lead to the US and the EU imposing costs, such as throwing Russia out of the G8 and coordinating targeted economic sanctions. And I really think that Putin did not expect that the US and the EU could impose the sanctions. These sanctions did harm the Russian economy, and I think the biggest impact might have been how it had a real chilling effect on foreign direct investment, and of course it sent the Russian ruble crashing. But unfortunately, these economic sanctions were blunted by a return to business as usual with Russia in 2015. And I think the most dramatic example of that, of course, was the agreement to build Nord Stream 2 by European firms. And of course, this was a signal that that Russia could expect Europe to return literally to business as usual and bring more Russian natural gas to Europe, increase the leverage that Russia has on Europe, and of course, bring more revenue to the Kremlin. So the lessons that Putin learned there was he could maintain his economy even under sanctions, and that secondly, that Europe would eventually return to business as usual. So to sum up, our misguided approach toward Russia began in the 90s with our assessment of what we thought was a Russia that was destined to democratize under Yeltsin. So how did we get Russia so wrong? How did we get Yeltsin and the early Putin so wrong? I think, primarily, I think as I suggested, is that for one thing, there were high expectations for Yeltsin as a reformer and an anti-communist. And there was also the danger of the communists coming back and actually defeating Yeltsin in a re-election bid. So there was a feeling that we had to go all in backing Yeltsin. There was also, of course, really strong economic reasons to prioritize Russia over its neighbors, and that was both presidents, both Yeltsin and Putin, were very much open to Western investors. Of course, there was a huge oil and gas bonanza. When I was Russia desk director, of course, I went probably every 3 or 4 months to Moscow, and I'd always meet with the representatives of ExxonMobil and other oil and gas companies, and it was clear that there were a lot of profits being made. It was also extraordinary for me, who lived in Moscow, during the Soviet days, to see so many American franchises, fast food restaurants in particular. So this was a big factor. There was a lot of money to be made in the early years in Russia. And then, of course, Yeltsin was seen as better than any other realistic competitor. The United States continued to have a fear of a extremist regime in Russia that would have nuclear weapons. So we did support Yeltsin. And then finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, the main priority, I think, was the US saw this as an opportunity, and Europe did too, as an opportunity to finally, after centuries of seeing an expansionist, aggressive, anti-democratic Russia, going back to the time of the czars, saw an opportunity to lock Russia into Western institutions, and so end these centuries of anti-democratic and expansionist leaders. So we brought them into the G8. They had no business being in the G8. If we're going to bring Russia into the G8, we should have brought in countries like the Netherlands and Spain, who had a comparable GDP. We helped them get into the WTO, and also we set up a special NATO-Russia Council. So clearly we stayed with this policy far too long, and I'd be happy to answer questions about why, or dig deeper into why we stayed so long with this, and take your questions.
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much for this very informative and very interesting lecture. I want to tell to our audience that for various reasons, including security reasons, we usually do not allow people to speak, but you can type your questions in Q&A and I will ask them. And also we have our students who prepared some questions. But before going to the students, I just wanted to to start with a small, maybe a strange question, because it's my question. I think it's a very unique opportunity, to talk to you, to a person who has seen a lot. You worked in Georgia, you worked in Ukraine, you know the field. And as you mentioned, for many years, there was sort of an inertia. Yeah, people did not understand Russia. People let Russia to get away with a lot of things, but now people are changing their minds. So I just wanted to know, how do you feel about that? Was it difficult to talk to other experts in your field? Was you like a black sheep that, warned people about this risk and people ignored you? And what are the strategies? What can you advise to our students, how to be persistent and how to advocate and, and convince other people when you feel that you're actually right and you know something?
Yeah. Well, I think, Timothy, I think that the good news here is there's been a complete turnaround in terms of our attitude towards Russia. The whole idea that we need to prioritize a relationship with Russia over a relationship with Ukraine in particular, that's totally debunked. And I think that when it comes to policy, I think there was a change in attitude of our political leaders, especially American, but not only American, but also I think the UK and of course the Eastern members of NATO. But there was a real difference of opinion about trade, and I think especially the Central Europeans went longer than we were willing to go in terms of continuing trade with Russia, and this was a policy decision that the Central Europeans made, particularly Germany. But I think, particularly after 2008, Washington had a very different opinion about dealing with Putin, with regime-affiliated businesses, especially in oil and gas. I think that the United States, on a very bipartisan basis, is extremely supportive of Ukraine. It's really quite extraordinary how much support there is. But people fly Ukrainian flags who've never seen a Ukrainian flag before. So it's really, I think quite extraordinary how attitudes toward Russia and Ukraine have completely changed.
Yeah, and yet, before going to students, I will still ask one kind of follow-up question to that, because you pointed out that obviously there has been this tremendous shift in the perception of Russia in the US and some other countries, and yet, Russia is still a member of the Organization for the Security and Cooperation. And Volodymyr Zelensky raised this issue, and of course it's a big political issue, how to decide whether Russia should be there or should it leave, and how it can be arranged. And I know that you have a lot of experience of working with this organization. Maybe you can explain us how it works, how people who work there think. Like, do you believe that the role of Russia will change there? So can you just reflect on that?
Yeah, frankly, I feel very conflicted about the issue. On the one hand, Russia really, I think, since 2007 in particular, has done everything it could to destroy the principles underlying the organization. And they, in recent times, they've all but destroyed the organization from within by refusing to join consensus on the continuation of the monitoring mission in Ukraine, for example. They haven't allowed to have the annual human rights meeting in Warsaw. So in many ways, they're destroying it from within, but also, and this is, I think, very similar to administration attitudes toward declaring Russia a terrorist state. There's also the need to continue to have forums or channels of not cooperation, but of dialogue with Russia. And of course, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe started off as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and its existence was based on this East-West dialogue. So, as I say, I'm conflicted. I agree with your president. Russia has no business being in an organization that believes that security among states depends on respect for human rights within states, the classic Helsinki principle. But on the other hand, we need to have some platforms to have a dialogue, and that's why the administration doesn't want to declare Russia a terrorist state, because it would imply we wouldn't have diplomatic relations. But again, I'm conflicted there as well.
Yeah, I see. Well, no easy answers here. So I wanted to give this chance to our student, Andrei Timchuk, to ask his questions that he prepared for this meeting. So Andrei, please, the virtual floor is yours.
Good evening. I'm Andrei. I'm master student of Kyiv School of Economics, and I would like to ask you a question about the statement, which is quite popular among Russians and among the people who support Russia in this war. They claim that this is the war between two superpowers, between Russia and the United States. And by saying that, they completely exclude Ukraine as an independent actor in the situation. But
Yeah.
This statement sounds a bit inconsistent, taking into account the fact that the United States were reluctant to be involved at the very beginning of the invasion and escalated from the side of Ukraine. So what is this statement based on, and how can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's a, as you suggested, it's a narrative that was made up completely in Moscow and emerged in particular after Russia had to, was forced for military reasons to withdraw from the northern parts of Ukraine that it occupied, and of course Putin knows that it would be basically the end of his regime if Ukraine, which he maintains is not even a nation, not even a country, was able to defeat the Russian army. So he changed the equation by saying that actually Russia is fighting NATO, or Russia is fighting the United States, and that I think is politically more palatable, more acceptable to him. He can't lose to Ukraine, but he can't, it's difficult for Russia to take on the entire Western world. And that idea has some traction in, what we call the global South, who are used to seeing or used to imagining America as being the great manipulator and behind all of the conflicts in the world, and so this plays into this perception of people, such as people in South Asia, particularly in India. This, I think, reinforces their own image of America as as the manipulating, interfering, militaristic superpower. And I don't think this narrative has some resonance in the far left, I think, in Europe and in the United States, but not in the mainstream.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned South Asia, and I remember how surprised I was when I found out how many Russian supporters are there even now in this conflict.
Yeah, especially India. In the beginning of the war, I got lots of requests to appear on Indian TV, and I did it once, and I never did it again, because yes, there were lots of misperceptions and really kind of conspiracy theories about the United States and its role.
Yeah. So I'll make a quick intervention. There is a question in the chat by Maxim Chibatarov. So he says that you mentioned that the US foreign policy at the time was to a large extent driven by the fear to see extremists with nuclear weapons in Russia. It seems that this fear has already materialized. What's the next big fear in the West now? A chaotic, uncontrolled collapse of Russia or something else? Can you shed some light on it?
Yeah, I think, among the community of academics and people in think tanks, who are paid to kind of look over the horizon at what might come next, there is this fear of a Russia that suddenly descends into chaos, and there's no command and control over the Russian military. One thing that Gorbachev always tried to scare the West about and try to scare them into supporting him financially was, if you don't support me, you'll have Yugoslavia with nukes. And of course, in the early 90s, Yugoslavia was a terrible place of conflict and bloodshed. But I think among the mainstream in the United States, there is a fear that Russia is exploiting with its rhetoric that if pushed too hard, if Russia is pushed into a corner, for example, by game-changing weapons given to Ukraine, that Putin is crazy enough or committed enough to defeating Ukraine that he will use nuclear weapons. And I think this is one fear, kind of a public fear in the United States, that is, as a way for Putin to have us deter ourselves from doing everything we can to support Ukraine. And examples of that is we haven't given them or given you, I should say, the Ukrainians, the kind of long-range artillery that you need, the so-called ATACMS rocket artillery system, which you should have. You should have everything that you need. You need more air defense, and I think there's actually going to be some movement towards giving Ukraine more and better air defense. And Timothy, let me just tell you that I can go right to 12 o'clock if you want. My meeting has changed, so I'm okay to stay at least another 10 minutes.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much for your time. But it also depends on the questions. I mean, if we have more questions, we can ask you to stay a bit longer. If there are no more questions, we can wrap it up. Actually, we will have another event just after the end of this podcast. We're also going to have some online Twitter space streaming with our students. So if someone from the audience is interested, you can also join us via the official Twitter account of the Kyiv School of Economics. Andriy, Anna Maria, if you have any question, you can take advantage of Ambassador Skelly time. If not, we can let him go to his business.
Yeah, I have a question. So my name is Anna Maria Mandi, and I'm an international relations student at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. And I have a question regarding the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2007. So during this summit, NATO expansion was discussed, and NATO member states decided to say that the door to NATO for Ukraine and Georgia is open, but they didn't make like a decision and final decision. And in your opinion, was it a mistake of NATO countries didn't take the initiative in the matter of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO? And also, was it one of the reasons for Russian invasion to Georgia a year later in 2008, and also to the annexation of Ukrainian territories of 2014?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's something that it's a question that I pondered for a long time. So actually, the summit was 2008. It was April of 2008, and as I say, I was on the Russia desk at that time, and I watched Putin almost immediately start to really turn up the pressure on Saakashvili, and in obvious attempts to provoke Saakashvili into military action. And I won't go over all the different steps that he took, but we watched with horror what was going on. And of course, in fact, in the end, Saakashvili rose to the bait. He allowed himself to be provoked in August, and then started to respond to the militia in South Ossetia respond to their mortar attacks against Georgian villages by launching a large attack against the so-called capital of South Ossetia, King Valley, on August 8th. And there's a direct line between that decision in the political declaration. Again, it was a political declaration. It wasn't legally binding or anything. And it was a result of U.S. U.S. efforts, very strong efforts, to get a membership action plan for both Ukraine and Georgia. And the only NATO summit that Putin went to was that one. And so he was assured when he went to bed that first night that there would not be a map for Ukraine and Georgia. But overnight, the American delegation continued to push for a mention of NATO membership in the future for Ukraine. So they were able to get that language put into the political declaration. And the next day, I don't know who briefed Putin on this. Must not have been a very pleasant briefing when he was informed, I'm sorry, Mr. President, there's language here saying that Ukraine will become a part of NATO. And by all accounts, Putin, as usual, overreacted. And he, much as he did in 2014 when he came back from Sochi and heard that that Yanukovych had been pushed out, and so he saw a conspiracy to by the Americans to slip in language to undermine Russia's strategic or interests or sphere of influence, and made a strategic decision that he would punish the United States for inserting this language, which was, as I say, non-binding. It was a political statement. Punish the United States by invading Georgia and sending the signal that if you go too far in offering NATO to my sphere of influence, I'm willing to resort to violence to prevent it. And then to answer the other part of your question, was it a mistake at the NATO summit in Bucharest to not have a clear path to NATO for Ukraine and Georgia? Of course it was. It was a terrible mistake. I mean, getting consensus among, I guess at that time was 27 members, maybe 28. Now I think it's 30. Getting consensus is always difficult. But the idea of just a political statement without any kind of enforcement behind it or any kind of clear path to membership was did more damage, I think, than it did good, because it left Ukraine and Georgia horribly exposed to Putin's predations, to his aggressive and expansionist tendency. So it left them in a gray zone, as we used to say at NATO. And I like to compare NATO to a gated community, and outside the gated community, you've got very, very bad gang of criminals. Unless you bring people into those walls, you're exposing them to attack. And that's what we did. We exposed both Georgia and Ukraine to attack. I can say this now. I never could have said that when I was at the State Department, though.
Well, we're lucky to have you, with your honest and fair assessment now. So I think it's a good time to wrap up. We all have some other events to attend to. Ambassador Kelly, thank you so much for your very informative insights. So we will be happy to see you in Kyiv again in
Oh,
future.
I'd love to come to Kyiv.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.